Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring a key component of human risk, the question of how each of us perceives risk and what that means for our decision making. To do that, I'm speaking to Michele Wucker. Michele knows a thing or two about risk perception, as she's the author of a best-selling book that explains a risk metaphor. A metaphor that was so influential, it moved stock markets and shaped financial policies across the globe. Astonishing as that sounds, it's not an exaggerated claim, because the metaphor in question is the Gray Rhino, and it refers to the idea of missing the big, obvious thing that's coming at you. The metaphor is designed to make a very simple point. The rhino is approaching you, and you have a choice. You either get trampled or you get out of the way, or you hop on the back of the rhino and use the crisis as an opportunity. Michele wrote about the phenomenon in a best-selling book called, appropriately enough, The Gray Rhino, How to Recognize and Act on the Obvious Dangers We Ignore. The reason the phrase in the book became so influential was that the Chinese government specifically referred to it as driving their policy. Having seen huge success with that book, Michele has just written a new one that takes the themes of the Gray Rhino and explores them in the context of individual decision-making. In You Are What You Risk, she explores how we perceive risk and what that means for the decisions we make. Obviously, when we think of human risk as a concept, it consists of lots of individual decisions taken by lots of individuals. Each of us, as Michele explains, has our own risk fingerprint. In our discussion, we explore the genesis of the Gray Rhino and how that then led Michele to write You Are What You Risk. What you're about to hear are some incredibly insightful perspectives on how we all think about risk. Before we begin, a quick logistical explanation. When I record the podcast, I do it using software that allows me to see the guests and them to see me. That meant I was able to see a picture on Michele's wall, which I referred to in our discussion and which prompted her to tell a fabulous story. You'll enjoy that much more if you can see the picture, which is why there's a link to it on the artist's website in the show notes. With all of that said, please enjoy my conversation with Michele Wucker on You Are What You Risk. Michele, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited.
I'm really excited about having you here. And look, you are best known for the term Gray Rhino, and it would be remiss of me not to start our conversation there. So can you tell the minor percentage of my listeners who've never heard of a Gray Rhino before what it is and how you came to come up with it? Because I think that's key to understanding your latest book and generally what you do.
Sure. So the Gray Rhino is a metaphor for the big scary thing that's coming at you. You know, horn because it's scary, and rhino because it's big and obvious, like you can't really ignore it. And it's gray because interestingly, if you ever went to the zoo when you were a child, like I did, you will learn that there is such a thing as a black rhino, which is not actually black. And there's a white rhino, which is also an official name of one of the 5 species of rhinos, which is not white. They're both gray. So it seemed to me to be a wonderful metaphor for the way we try to avoid obvious things. And I wanted also to distinguish it. You know, we've got all these financial metaphors, you know, at the financial zoo, and you have the elephant in the room, but that normalizes doing and saying nothing. It just kind of stands there, and the implication is that it's in the room, and you just kind of work around it and you deal with it. But the Gray Rhino is coming at you. You know, it's coming right at you, and it was inspired from my early days as a financial journalist when I was writing about the Argentinian debt crisis in 2000, 2001. And a proposal that went around about 9 months before the collapse to restructure the debt, to do a haircut and move on. And that didn't happen. And so instead of the proposal to do a 30% haircut, creditors lost 70%, which, if my math is right, is not a great deal. And so 10 years later, Greece was in a similar situation. And I wrote a white paper that got a lot of attention. They talked about it on CNBC and other places. And it was one of the early public calls for a preemptive restructuring in Greece to avoid a chaotic default, which at the time would have brought the euro down. And so right around the time Greece and its creditors were coming to an agreement, I was sort of dealing with, personal and career gray rhinos of my own, burning out. So I did a reset, a 2-week executive education course at the Harvard Kennedy School that the World Economic Forum put together for the Forum of Young Global Leaders, of which I'm a proud alumna. And in that, I decided I needed to be writing again. And the big question in front of me was, okay, what makes the difference between Greece and Argentina? They both saw a big scary thing with a horn coming right at them. Argentina decided not to deal with it. Greece did. What makes the difference? And the Gray Rhino was really a way to talk about that question in a way that wasn't all about geeky sovereign debt yields, which, I understand some people's eyes glaze over when I talk about.
And so you wrote the book and it's turned into a huge success. And I love the fact that your company is also named after that. So this is an iconic thing. And sad, this is a podcast, but as I look behind you as I record this, there's even a picture of a rhino there as well. So this is a pervasive piece of who you are. And it's that's inspired your latest book. And I wonder can you talk to us a little bit about the transition between what you wrote before and what you have just written?
Sure, absolutely. And since you mentioned the picture behind me, I have to describe it. It's by a Chicago artist, Matthew Collianese. He calls himself the Pig Shark. And it's a sort of, a photo of a dystopian urban streetscape and a photo of a rhino in there and a little girl that looks like a cross between Banksy and the Fearless Girl from Wall Street is standing there with a paintbrush with fuchsia paint on the end of it. And she's painted all the rhino's toes fuchsia. And it just spoke to me. And I actually found it right after I went downtown to the Magnificent Mile to do an interview for WGN Radio, a couple days after the Chinese government used the Gray Rhino in a front page editorial on People's Daily saying you need to watch out for Gray Rhino financial risks. And the stocks perceived as riskiest fell by around 5% in a single day. And so I was down there being interviewed about that and, came out of WGN and there was an art fair and this picture was there and it just was screaming at me. So it's a bit of a tangent.
What a great story. Because I thought you'd had it commissioned, but what a lovely story that you just randomly found it in a really serendipitous moment.
It was just absolutely perfect. And the funny thing was a few days earlier when the People's Daily story came out, I had just been flying back from New York, so had been off email, and I open up my computer and it's full of emails from friends in China, reporters in China, and all that stuff. And I went to a cocktail that afternoon, and saw some friends. And they're like, "Oh, what have you been up to?" I'm like, I just crashed the Chinese stock market today.
Not much. Oops.
So anyway, the Gray Rhino was very big, is still very big in China, and the government has used it both to frame and strategize some of their efforts on financial risk, but also to communicate it, which is so important because a lot of people who are in the risk business don't always communicate it in a way that you can really connect with. And in fact, if you've been watching the headlines the last couple months, China's top regulatory officials have been very, very vocal about real estate prices as a Gray Rhino for China. So anyway, there's been a lot of impact, really in the ways that I'd hoped as a financial policy geek. But what surprised me was that when I was doing the book tour for the Gray Rhino, at almost every session, someone raised their hand and said, "How do I apply this to my personal life?" And in fact, in Shanghai, that summer that the book got really, really big, this super hip young guy in a black T-shirt came up to me and wanted a selfie and an autograph. And he says, "You helped me so much with my life." And I was moved, and because he had driven through these horrible storms to get there. It took 3 times as long as it should have to get there. And I was really moved by this response, but I didn't know what to do with it because I don't write self-help books. I mean, it seemed like I was getting such an organic response, but I didn't know what to do with it. So I talked to my friends about it. And I talked in particular to one friend who was the CEO of a private equity firm working on environmental issues. And he had been a great sounding board for the Gray Rhino itself. And I said, "Yeah, what do I do with this?" He says, "Well, it's more connected than you think. He said, last week, my investment committee sat down and we talked about the investments that, to put it politely, did not meet our expectations. And he's a very polite friend. And my friend said, in every case, all of the red flags were there in the due diligence that we had done. He said, but it wasn't the technology. It wasn't the business model. It wasn't the economy as a whole. It wasn't some weird competition. He said it was bad personal risk behavior by the CEO. It was domestic violence. It was speeding. It was drunk driving. And he said there's this huge connection between your personal relationship with risk and the gray rhinos that you see and deal with or don't, and your business performance. And as we've seen over the past year, it has everything to do with policy performance as well. You've seen the ways that different countries deal with COVID, and it all has to do with their gray rhino relationship.
And so you thought, I've got to write about this, and I'll take this, and hence the book. Yeah, it is. I had actually started out trying to make sense of this. I did a little quiz, just kind of, fun quiz, how often do you go to the dentist and things like that, and came up with these 5 gray rhino personalities. And I got this wonderful Chicago artist to do some cartoons with it. I just kind of put it up there to see what I got. And people really responded to it. And so a lot of the questions were about things in life, health, about finance, about relationships. Your friends are all telling you that you need to dump that significant other who's a loser, and you either do it or you don't. I mean, you either, sock away money for a rainy day or you don't. You get the oil changed in your car or you don't. And that was the original approach. And the book very much does deal with these personal gray rhinos, health, finance, relationships, things like that, and careers, which is huge. It's at the intersection of personal and professional. But as COVID happened, I was sort of wrapping up the book, or so I thought. I ended up going a different direction because it was everywhere, like the risk decisions that people were making. Are you going to wear a mask or are you not? Are you going to wear a mask to protect yourself or to protect other people? And it seemed like every single decision was a risk decision. And it really struck me that these risk decisions that we make say everything about who we are. Like, if you want to know who someone is, ask them, what's a risk you're willing to take? What's a risk you're not willing to take? And you can read these forensically, as much as you would an actual fingerprint, because your relationship with risk says what you value. It says who you care about, what you care about. It's about how you calculate the risks around you or not. What's important and what's not. And it goes back to our innate personality, the people around us, and even weird things that I discovered, like whether you ate spicy food. And so all of this stuff together really says who you are. And that's how I came up with the title of the book. It's You Are What You Risk. And I thought it was fascinating as I was reading it, because when you think about life, there are certain situations when you are specifically asked about your risk appetite. And so whether that's how spicy do you want your pizza to be, or, what's your risk appetite for financial investment? So there are these isolated incidents where the question is framed in that way. But as you were unpicking it, actually, there are tons of times where it's not framed in that way, and yet we are still making decisions on that same basis. So you're absolutely, I sort of found myself going, okay, well, that's an obvious time where they do talk about it in those terms, but most of the time we don't, and yet we are making those decisions.
Absolutely. Well, Cindy McGovern, who I interviewed in the book, she's author of another great book called Every Job is a Sales Job. And she says every single decision you make is a risk decision because, in some ways, risk and choice are very, very closely related. And when you look at things through a risk lens, it changes the way you see them. Like I often ask at workshops, how much time do you leave to go to the airport? And that works really well in Chicago because let me tell you, getting to O'Hare Midway, which some other people use, is not so much fun.
The answer is get the train, right, in Chicago. Surely that's my normal trick there, but
depending on where you are, you have to go downtown to get the train.
So this is true. I'm always coming from downtown, so this is a fair point.
So, so I ask people, how much time do you leave to the airport? And then what happens is if someone's traveling with a colleague who has different preferences, or if they're traveling with a significant other or a friend, I mean, traveling with someone is a real test of your friendship. But it's also
or non-friendship if it doesn't go well.
It's true. Luckily, all the people I've traveled with, I've managed to work things out with. But it's all about the risks that each person is willing to take or not. And you can sit back and say, oh, this person is such a jerk. He makes me stress out waiting till the last minute to get to the airport. But when you think about it as risk choices and how different people deal with risk in different ways, it makes it a lot easier to come up with a common ground when you know why people are doing what they are. And what's interesting is there was an Atlantic article that went viral a couple years ago about this whole question of airports. And they interviewed some psychologists, and the conclusion was the people who wait till the last minute are like racing to the gate as the door's about to slam shut. They're not necessarily less afraid of missing the plane than the people who go and sit there and, get bored. They just have a different way of controlling it. It's very similar to wearing a mask or not wearing a mask. You see a lot of people who refuse to wear a mask. It's their way of being defiant against the virus. It's not a very effective way. In fact, it's quite a dangerous way. But in a certain way, the logic is similar. Like people like control. People hate uncertainty. Oh, and so in some cases, you control what you can control, even if it's a really bad risk decision.
And I love the fact that you depict in the book this idea that these different perspectives. We often don't understand other people's risk appetite. But as you point out, there are certain situations where the risks are different. There's a very good reason. So walking at night, it's a different proposition if you are a man, of decent stature, as opposed to if you are a woman. The risks are very, very different. And so we can see there's a good example of how you might take the same situation, take a different perspective. And it really made me think that, you were getting into the sort of, diversity of opinion topics where we often, in a polarized world, I think this is really interesting because very often, if we look at lots of decisions as involving risk, we can start to see actually some of not all of them, but some of the differences of opinion come from these different perspectives. And I thought, what started out in my mind is this is going to be a risk book. Actually, you got into, sort of diversity type topics and a whole range of other 21st century dynamics that was fascinating.
So the Gray Rhino was about the organizational dynamics and the sort of, structural and process obstacles to dealing with gray rhinos. And certainly I got into cognitive biases. But the new book takes it in a whole different direction that does circle back. But one of the things that I look at in this book that doesn't come up so much in the Gray Rhino is the difference in risk attitudes and risk personalities. And in fact, I profile Jeff Trickey, who's based in the UK in Tunbridge Wells. I took advantage of a speaking engagement in Belgium to pop over to the UK and go down and visit. So his company is Psychological Consultancy, and they have this tool called the Risk Type Compass that I'm completely obsessed with. And it's based on, solid psychometric science, the Hogan method and big 5 personality types and stuff. And I know there's a huge debate about psychometric tests, but I'm not going there. I think that these tests are useful as long as you understand their limitations and their capabilities. But so he developed this risk type compass, which has, 2 poles, like a real compass. And he was so excited about it when he told me about it. But it's basically, how calm or anxious you are facing risk, or how impulsive or methodical you are in dealing with it. And there are, of course, 4 other, northeast, southeast, whatever combinations. So you get these 8 different personalities. And he talked about using them with boards. And he said it was fascinating that they come back and they do a scatter plot of, the different risk personalities on the board. And he said the people with similar types actually tended to sit next to each other in the room if it wasn't assigned seating. And one of the things we don't look at enough when we talk about board diversity is actually risk personality. I think it's pretty obvious if you have people from the same profession, you need to shake it up a little bit. If it's all lawyers, they're going to come up with a different conclusion from, engineers or marketing people. We know the importance of gender and demographic diversity, whether, by age or ethnicity. That those are very important perspectives to come in, particularly if your clients are in those demographics as well. You want to be sure that you've got someone to represent those. But not everybody from every demographic group is the same risk profile. And we make a mistake if we assume that. And it makes a ton of sense to very explicitly consider, what's your risk personality? How do you deal with risk? Do you see risk as inherently a negative or a positive value proposition? Because we all come at it from very different ways. And now that boards are paying a lot more attention to risk governance, the number of boards with risk committees has gone up. Every time I look, it's gone up again. So I hate to quote a number because it'll be obsolete by tomorrow. But looking at risk governance, you need to look at personalities and at the people as well. Since the great financial crisis, more and more boards have, made their risk lists and their heat maps and all of that and said, okay, we're going to look at all the risks that we're facing. We've identified the risks. And then they washed their hands. They said, okay, well, we checked the box. We identified the risks. So, okay, all done. Here's your report. But, they're really at very early stages in looking at their responses, both their governance capabilities, things like, do you have a risk committee? But again, you don't want to have a risk committee just to have a risk committee. You actually want to be doing something about it. But looking at responses, is this a company that's flexible and can pivot and can, see the risk and do something and turn it into an opportunity? We've seen a lot of that over the past year with COVID, companies that were able to cope and the companies that weren't. And so this response element of risk management is so important and so very, very early in stages of being adopted.
When you talk in those terms, logically speaking, if you looked at a company, you go, well, that's what they're there. That's what the senior levels of the organization are there to manage this stuff, to think about these things and handle it. And of course, that's happening. There are plenty of companies that have very sophisticated looking structures containing lots of models that aren't necessarily very good at predicting the future, as we've seen. There are others that do it maybe more intuitively, less using models, but do it very well. So there's a range of skills there. And I think one of the challenges is it's seen as a sort of technical skill set. And, these are the risk professional, as if to say sort of, anybody else is a risk amateur and doesn't know what they're doing. But of course, we all have an instinctive taste for it. And the bit I thought was really interesting was as you go through the book, you have terms and you explain what those terms mean. And you provide a vocabulary and a glossary or a dictionary for people to navigate this piece. And I thought that was a nice thing you continue. So the Gray Rhino is a label that allows people to have a discussion. And what you've done here is given people a sort of lexicon of terms that they can really start to understand this stuff. And I think that's hugely helpful in terms of demystifying it, because if we haven't got the language or the terms to use, then we can't really start grappling with the issues. And I was really struck by that was a key component of the way you'd written the book, that explaining the language and giving people the tools to have the discussion seemed to me to be a key part of what you were driving at.
Thanks. That makes me really happy because that's what I was trying to do with it, and actually had some really good input from friends and colleagues on that. David Koenig, the founder of Directors and Chief Risk Officers Institute, which has a new risk certificate, was the one who really suggested, building up those names and those words, the vocabulary, and my editor said, let's pull these out, and the designer did a really great job with pulling them out. But it goes back to something I said earlier about communication of risk. Even the words that you mentioned, the risk professional, if you're not risk professional, then you're an amateur. You don't know what you're doing. And going around the world, I spoke in particular with a lot of business continuity and risk management professionals, or what's a better word, people. And they often expressed some frustration at how hard it was to get people in other parts of the company to incorporate risk into the way they thought about things. And it really does come down to language and communication. It's just like, the Gray Rhino is a way to get us to wake up to the fact that we're more likely to ignore things than we think, but we're not condemned to do it. And it's a much more accessible, emotionally available way of talking about things. That, the Aesop knew what he was doing about bringing in those animals.
Right.
And I think having terms that let us talk about risk is so important. And one of the things that I discovered was there isn't a common way to talk about risk itself. As I said, some people see it as positive. They see it as an opportunity. Some people only see it as a danger or a peril. In technical financial communities, they're like, well, risk is something you can quantify and uncertainty is something that you can't. But for lay people, that distinction doesn't exist at all. And in different disciplines, it's completely different conversations. And unfortunately, a lot of those specialized conversations don't translate very well to you and me, or to helping a financial advisor talk with their clients, or the members of the family with very, very different ideas about how to approach the risk. It's not actually a risk, the inevitability of their parents getting older. The risk is that it will happen in a chaotic way rather than an orderly way. But we really need new ways of talking about these things. And so that's why I felt the vocabulary was so important and such a key part of the book, even though the vocabulary part of it came after the book was fairly far along in the process.
And did you struggle to find definitions and terms? Was that an easy exercise? Because if I look at something like Risk Fingerprint, I love that because I sort of went, oh, that's, it's very visual, it's very understandable, and it's sort of, you can kind of guess what it is. When you start to get into things like risk appetite and various, it gets a little bit more difficult. Was it easy compiling the words and finding the definitions, or did you have to sort of scrabble around and were there conflicting views on it? Because, creating a vocabulary, it sounds easy, but actually you have to sort of get the right nuances and make sure you've covered all the bases and think it through. And of course, if you're publishing it in a book, then you potentially open season on you because you've given people clear target. Well, that's not how I look at it type responses to it. So was that an easy thing to do, or was it quite challenging?
Well, there are really two types of vocabulary in the book. There were things where risk professionals talk about it in a certain way, like risk appetite, risk tolerance. Those are very in the industry terms. And I felt it was important to restate them in a very simple way so that their clients would understand what they were talking about. And also so that they'd have a common way of talking about it. And then some of the other words were things that really came up during the process of writing. And some of them were things that my editor saw and said, this is really interesting. You should do more with this. Risk empathy was one of those. And I was very.
Do you want to explain that to listeners? Because I think that's fascinating.
So risk empathy, and this is actually going to take us back to the fingerprint, which I'll talk about next, because you really need to understand that. But once you understand your own risk fingerprint, you can start looking at the risk fingerprints of the people around you, understanding why they feel the way about risk that they do, understanding what perhaps makes them more comfortable or less comfortable. And then integrating that information into what you do to help them feel more comfortable taking a positive risk, or do you pull them back a little from the edge of just, jumping over like a lemming? So it's really a way of understanding the people around you. And of course, empathy is a huge buzzword in the business community lately. Belinda Palmer in the UK is doing some really great work with the empathy business. In the book, I quoted Maria Ross, who's got a great book called The Empathy Edge. And it's part of a new business vocabulary that focuses more on the human element. And interestingly, as machines do more and more and more and more, this human element is going to become more and more valuable. The question is, what can humans do that machines can't? Well, can machines show empathy? There actually are AI companies that are trying to get machines to understand people's emotions, but that's going to be a long way down the road. But really understanding what motivates people, what makes them more productive, what makes them feel safer, what makes them want to stay in your company or leave. all of that human factor is so important, and it's going to be increasingly so in the future of work as AI does more things, as automation comes things. And we really need to think about what the human skills are that we have that make us stand out as opposed to machines. So this is actually part of a much bigger conversation.
And it struck me that, when you talk about technology and what you've just mentioned there is a personal bugbear of mine, because the natural logic around human risk, people always say, well, the machines are going to reduce the risk posed by individuals. And I'm saying, well, actually, true for the repeat tasks, not true if you look at what the human population is going to be doing, which is precisely the things we're good at, that actually where we pose the largest amount of risk with judgment, nuance, and all those things. And so I always say the argument that technology is actually going to increase human risk as opposed to decrease it. But I was struck as looking at it, you've got into space of sort of analyzing what do we mean by risk and how it affects us the whole time. And of course, that topic is highly relevant for things like driverless cars, where we are now in a world where we're having to codify these things that we've sort of kept hidden away. But if with the stark face of an algorithm in front of you need to program, and a car that you need to decide what is it going to do in these certain circumstances that may be unusual but could arise. It struck me that this was also helpful for that process, because actually what you're doing is fleshing out things that we all naturally do that we sort of don't like to talk about. We kind of keep it going. Let's not have a discussion about it. It's a bit difficult, a bit complicated. We'll leave that to the quote risk professionals. So I thought it was actually very timely in the sense of dealing with some of these sort of other ethical issues around artificial intelligence and technology as we're having to think about this topic for those purposes as well. Absolutely.
Well, you mentioned algorithms, and in many cases, we're seeing that algorithms are actually magnifying some of the human flaws we have. Some of the racial problems that algorithms have been having. And you have to remember that humans are programming all these machines. We're creating the framework and they often amplify whatever it is that we're doing. You look at sort of, automated trading. That just, that makes the market swings wider. So machines make things more of what humans do. So you're completely right. It absolutely increases human risk. And the car driving thing is so interesting because they've done surveys in different countries about what choices people would make if, the car's driving and it's going to kill someone no matter what. Do you kill the old person? Do you kill the pregnant mom with the baby? In different countries and different cultures had very, very different responses to those. So what do you do when, for example, you're exporting a car from one country to another? How is it programmed? And, I did a sort of a tongue-in-cheek piece a ways back about, it was when people were talking about citizenship for machines, when Sophia, this robot was granted her certificate of citizenship. And so sort of, tongue in cheek, but actually talking about serious questions. Do we need passports, passports for machines? Which sounds ridiculous, but the underlying question of when machines are programmed with values from one country, what happens if they're in a different country? What if the self-driving car from a country that respects old people goes to a country that likes the young people? And then what are the liability issues with that? It's huge.
I was just thinking, the logical extension is, right, you're not buying German engineering, you're buying German morality and ethics. And so that becomes the distinguishing factor as to which car you choose. Actually, I prefer a bit of Japanese ethics, so I'll have one of theirs. But it is amazing. And it is, I think, that's why I'm really fascinated by what you're doing and what you're looking at here, because you are exposing something that I think, we have shied away from a little bit. And that's why I think we don't have the vocabulary, because it is in that too difficult box, or it's sort of, something I either don't want to think about, can't think about, too difficult, we'll just park it. And so we're starting to expose these things societally, and we can see through, a lot of the things that have been happening, whether it's Black Lives Matter or other movements, that we are starting to think about these topics. And so the fact that the vocabulary doesn't exist, I think, is indicative of the fact that we haven't been talking about it. And we all intuitively understand it.
Absolutely. And it actually brings me back to the risk fingerprint, if we could circle back, because I realized I talked about risk empathy before really talking more about the fingerprint, which is really the essence of the book. So this was another thing that happened later on in the process. I referred to risk fingerprints in the book, and that's It's the thing, it's the set of choice you make, but also implies all of the influences on them. Just like a fingerprint that a detective would look at. So you've got like the arcs and the whorls, and that's genetically set. And like you can't really change that. It's what your DNA says is there. And that's your innate personality, the impulsivity or caution or the emotional part of it. But then there are things that you can do. Like if you use lots of nice lotion to keep your hands soft, or if you're doing a lot of manual labor, that's going to affect the fingerprint. And that to me is a metaphor for the habits that we develop, the way that we really treat the risks in our lives and how we manage our responses. And then a scar, you cut your finger on something, that's going to change your fingerprint itself. physically, but it's also in a risk sense going to change how you feel about knives or was that cut you. And they say once burned, twice shy. Your past experiences go into that whole set of factors behind each risk decision that you make. And there are some temporary factors. You're in the bathtub and your finger gets all wrinkled. Similarly, the physical environment affects your risk decisions in ways that you might even not think of. I certainly hadn't. You eat the spicy food and your risk tolerance goes up. In the cold, you're more likely to be risk seeking. The fragrance in the room, the sort of colors and other things that affect your heart rate variability and your mood and how tired you are. How much cortisol is running through your blood. There's a lot of real, neurobiological stuff in there. So those are all unconscious, but we've also seen a lot of attention lately to mild mindfulness, to mind-body connection. Traders put a lot of this science to work, really paying attention, using biofeedback, looking at their physical state to optimize their trading behavior. And we can do that for any sort of risk decision that we make. So your risk fingerprint really pulls that all together. It's both the innate traits, but also the environmental factors that change the way that you relate to risk. And that, again, says everything about who you are, just as much as a fingerprint on a glass that they dust with that little black powder says who you are.
I was struck that you, and I think you logically have to in terms of the subject matter, but you reveal some personal details in there. And there's a lot of you in the book in terms of situation and risks that you've taken and how you look at the world. And I think that makes it very engaging, but I think it's also a helpful guide in so that people can see it. And it's a natural question I think people would ask you. And I'm intrigued as to the process that you've gone through in writing it. How has that changed you and your perspective on risk? And I guess so the extension of the question is sort of your risk fingerprint. Has writing the book changed that at all?
Such a great question. And, it's certainly something I was conscious of. I realize I can't get people to talk about risk fingerprints unless I talk about my own. People understand by stories and examples. And if I'm going to be like a closed off person who doesn't talk about my own risk fingerprint, then how can I really be, showing, doing and not just saying. And that was hard. It was very hard. I talked about my celiac disease and the risk process entails and some of the career risks and, the sort of struggles with my health.
Yeah, because it was in parts very close to a confessional in some respects, where you were sort of putting things there that didn't make me feel uncomfortable. But I thought, wow, this is, you'd gone beyond the basic narrative of your life. And you were really picking into things that were genuine risk decisions. That you're sort of, if you ask people the question, when have you taken a risk? You could come up with a nonsense sort of answer that's not really taking a risk. My socks didn't match today type thing. And then nobody noticed type nonsense. Almost like when you do a job interview and say, what are your weaknesses? And people come up with nonsense, actually a strength. And I read it and I thought, you very quickly demonstrated you weren't in that game. You were genuinely talking about some things that really were risks and really were decisions and were very personal to you. Yeah,
I felt that in a book that's about individuals, that's what I had to do. And of course, the book itself was a big risk for me as I talk about it. I come from a policy and finance and business and strategy world. Like I'm happy with spreadsheets and talking about, weird bond math and stuff like that. And I had just felt such an outpouring from my readers of wanting more of that personal stuff. And I do think listening is important. I mean, my whole career has been, listening, taking in information. So that was a new direction for me. But it also was fascinating to start to understand this feedback loop between, organizational culture and policy environments and individual decisions. In that, policymakers respond on a certain level to what their constituents say, but what policymakers do in turn changes how constituents feel. As I was giving a talk in Milwaukee, and in the Q&A session, a nurse stood up and she said, with all these changes in healthcare policy, I'm seeing a lot more stressed out, freaked out patients with mental health issues coming in specifically because of health policies. And, you look at COVID, you look at how some people in the population get protected and some people don't. You look at all of the praise of the frontline workers, but, are they getting the support that they really need? And I think it's really important to look at that it doesn't happen in isolation. And what's interesting about that is that throughout my career, I started early on as a journalist, and I guess you never stop being one, but you're told that, you're just presenting the facts in the story and you're not analyzing it and taking it any further. And in that sense, I haven't been a quote unquote journalist in a very long time. But in the think tank world, when I was running a think tank in New York and we had a magazine, World Policy Journal, one of the things that was very important to me was sort of like bringing up voices that might not be heard otherwise. People have something important to say, but also talking about policy issues in a way that was relevant. I used to say a lot, policy is not just for wonks. And I still mean that. Sometimes I'll call myself a policy not so wonk. But, because it's so important for people to understand the policy decisions that are being made up high or within a company, to understand the business strategy decisions up high and what you do about it. There was one talk I was giving about, it was about the Gray Rhino and about responding to things. And someone raised their hand and they said, well, what if you're raising these issues and your boss just doesn't want to listen and the people upstairs just don't want to listen? And my response was, you're not going to want to hear this, but maybe you should look for another job.
It's funny. It's a great question because they're sort of looking for the secret sauce. This is how you will persuade them is implicit in the question. And actually,
tell your boss to read my book. That's what I should have said.
Right. Yes.
But it's actually really funny. I actually use that technique on, sort of personal stuff. A friend who's like years behind on tax returns, or someone else who was like, had allergies and wouldn't go to the doctor about it. To both of them, I said, kind of half joking, but not really, haven't you read my book? And it worked. Not completely. Like they made the baby steps. They didn't follow through the whole way. But sometimes asking these simple questions, what's my Gray Rhino? What's the big thing in front of me? And am I dealing with it the way that I should? What's my risk fingerprint? Am I making good risk decisions? And if not, how can I do a better job? Can I surround myself with people who can help me? If I know I go and take bad risks, can I, get a wingman to hold me back? Can I find a chatty best friend who says what nobody else has the guts to say? And once you understand your own risk fingerprint, you can create better habits. You can surround yourself with the people and the resources that you need to do different things. And then you can also start applying that to the people around you, the risk empathy that I was talking about. And this is so powerful when it comes to, board decisions, to team dynamics, even to, sales. As I write about in the book, Cindy told me about a client who was really afraid of doing anything that would make a really difficult, impossible client of theirs leave. And we talked with Cindy. Cindy talked to the client about what the actual risk was and what she was most afraid of. And in that case, the ultimate conclusion was that the biggest risk was that obnoxious client would stay with the company. because it was taking time that she could spend pursuing other clients who were likely to be bigger accounts and easier to deal with. So that opportunity cost element of risk decisions is hugely important.
And as you were talking, it sort of struck me, and I don't want to remove the market for your book, although this will take a few years, but I mean, it struck me that when you depict it in those terms, this isn't a nice to have, right? This is something we should all be doing because we're all it's almost like it's a basic skill that perhaps a bit like cookery, we ought to be teaching people at a younger age because you are going to be doing this stuff, whether you want to or not, you're going to be doing this stuff throughout your life. And we don't really equip people to do it. And hence you can write the book, because if we did, we'd have the vocabulary, we'd have the thing, and then this book would never have happened. So in a parallel universe, we could be teaching people at school or somewhere about these topics. And it seems to me that that's missing, because when you depict it the way you just have, this is an absolutely core skill to navigate life. Otherwise, the risk, pun intended, is that you will make bad decisions, or you won't make the best possible decisions. Let me put it that way.
Absolutely. And I do talk about risk literacy in the book, and it's so important. And people, I think right now are pushing themselves. People can afford to, and, go on some sort of, outward adventure where you take risks out in the wilderness and things like that. But, or these, escape rooms and things where you're forced to make choices and you're in a pressure situation, or, all these adventure sports. There's actually been an increase in those in recent years. And I talk a little bit in the book about that. And in some ways, it's because certain risks in life have been reduced. You hear about the nanny state, you hear about, people, over padding childhood, playgrounds, so that you just don't want to create any possibility that your children are going to be hurt. But you're actually not teaching them an important skill. I mean, you need to know what to do to not get hurt. It's like people who lose their sense of touch. It's like, you need to know that it's going to hurt if you touch that flame, if you stick your finger in it. And, it's not just, risk decisions themselves, but the ability to make good risk decisions, but also to deal with uncertainty, which is so closely tied to risk, no matter what the technical financial definition is so closely tied to creativity, to innovation, to good cost benefit analysis, to all of these other life skills. And again, I go back to the skills that humans can do that machines are never going to be as good as we are at.
Do you think and I know this will depend on each individual's risk fingerprint, but as you're talking, I'm wondering sort of your perspective on, humanity. Are we not taking enough risk? Are we taking too much? What's your sort of general view on things? Because, and we can obviously pick extreme examples of incredibly cautious people that are missing opportunities and lunatics that are taking risk. But as a species, do you have a sense that where do you think we sit? And there are obviously cultural differences as well. But what's your perspective on humanity? Should we be taking more risk? Are we not taking enough? Is that health and safety culture curbing something that we ought to be trying to incentivize, or is it actually quite sensible?
Well, it actually goes back to the definition of risk and what you mean by, are we taking enough risk? And that goes back to whether you see risk as, positive or negative or value neutral. And I think that the question is different. And also whether you're talking about passive risks or active risks. I mean, active risks is where you're like, I'm going to put all my money in GameStop. Like, please don't. but so that's an active risk. It's something you make a choice to do. But you also take a risk when you don't deal with an obvious risk, when you let the Gray Rhino run you over. And this, you see, the people who don't change their diets when their doctor says they have hypertension, or they don't change jobs when they know that their boss is a jerk, or things like that. And I'm not sure if I really have an answer for humanity as a whole, partly because I am so interested right now in the micro, in the decisions that individuals make, and how the decisions of 7-something billion individuals come together, in their own communities, in their own nations and societies, and then eventually on a planetary level as well. As we're certainly seeing with climate. I mean, I think with climate, we're definitely taking way too big a passive risk in not doing enough to solve the problem. I mean, luckily, we're starting to see a little bit more action, but it's not nearly as much as it needs to be. I do think that humanity in general is taking way too many passive risks. That may be because that's what my work focuses on, these risks that we take by not dealing with risks. And one of the points I often have to make is that it often feels risky to head off a risk, that people are more afraid of doing the wrong thing to head off the risk than doing the right thing. Because if you do the right thing and the risk disappears, people are going to say you're a Cassandra. They're like, oh, there was no risk there in the first place. You're such an idiot. Right. And, we don't do a good enough job of rewarding people for heading off risks. What do we reward people for? When the tower falls down, we reward them for picking up the pieces. So we need to think a lot more about how we can better reward people who are long-term thinkers, who are proactive, who are risk aware, and who make the hard decisions that keep us from getting trampled.
And it is fascinating. Having been a regulator, I'm very sympathetic to the thing is you when it goes right, no one notices. When it goes hideously wrong, you're in the fire and you're an idiot, a bunch of fools. And I do think there's something fascinating around that, which is sort of we discourage people from stepping in. And there's that old adage of, wait until everybody knows the ship is sinking before you take control of it. Otherwise, you'll be blamed for the thing going down in the first place. And I think there is something fascinating about our general propensity and probably the vocabulary that accompanies it, where, as you say, we do discourage sensible handling risk. We don't want, we want people to go in and be heroic and save the day. But we sort of, that scenario, providing you rescue it. But if you just try and do something and you fail, that you're an idiot. And I do think there is that's not helpful. And I was thinking as you were responding, I love that active versus passive response to the question, because I was looking and saying, I think there's a ton of untapped potential of people who aren't taking opportunities, either because those opportunities don't exist or they're not taking them when they do exist, to kind of get the best out of the species. And so I see lots of wasted opportunities and people who have talents that could really be utilized, but we have built structures that prevent that from happening. So I thought that's where you might end up. But I think your active passive interest, I wonder, I presume you would agree with me that we, there is so much untapped potential out there that we could get so much more out of people if we gave them the opportunity to do that.
I'm so glad you brought that up because in chapter 8, which is all about risk and purpose and some of the decisions that we make about who's worth taking a risk on, there's a little bit in there about who's quote unquote creditworthy and the criteria that we set up to give people access to the capital that they need to take risks and to take good risks. And something that's not in the book, but that's been on my mind lately is there's been some research around why students from poor neighborhoods don't go to college more often, and not just because of the cost, but because of the risk calculation. Like if you're a minority and you go through and somebody sees a quote unquote ethnic name or pastime or something on your CV, or places other kinds of obstacles in front of you, which so many people of color face, well, their cost benefit calculus is very, very different and completely legitimate. Like, do you want to go in debt? Do you want to spend all that money on school when you come out and it's not guaranteed that people are going to recognize your skills and your talent? And that, that goes for women as well. And I think we need to set up a much better safety net system so that people can take the kind of risks that they need. Education, for example. I mean, that's the first biggest investment that most people make. I mean, you're in your late teens, early 20s, and you take on tens of thousands of dollars in debt. I mean, that's that's really huge. And you're making that decision at a time when your brain's not even fully formed and capable of making good risk decisions. And often, your parents make that decision for you. And for people who come from families that can support them if they stumble, it's a much easier decision. And I talk a little bit in the book about risk privilege, that there are some situations where actually making a choice is a privilege. And in many cases, something that we might talk about as risky, say a refugee, crossing dangerous shark-infested waters on a little boat, doesn't involve as much of a choice as we might think, because it's a choice between certain death at home and, possible death and uncertainty and all these other things. And, how much choice do they really, really have there? So in terms of policy things, and I'm hoping to go back a little bit to some of my policy hat using this book to do so, but developing more policy recommendations to create a risk ecosystem that allows more people to take good risks, investing in your education, leaving a tedious job to do a social enterprise. I mean, right now, a lot of the social enterprises are run by, upper and upper middle class white kids who have the friends and family who have the ability to fall back. But there are a lot of other people with big dreams for making the world a better place who might not have those resources. And as you said, it's a huge, huge, huge issue of untapped human potential. And what if we were to create the policy ecosystem that taps all of that human potential? And what are we risking by not doing so?
And as you were talking, I was thinking, I mean, the big difference, there are many differences, but one of the, between the country you're in and the one I'm in is healthcare provision. We have that free healthcare provision that is being challenged as a concept, but it removes an encumbrance. And it struck me that as you were talking around decision making, of course, if you are unencumbered, either financially or in terms of having role models, much easier to make those decisions. And it feels like, as you say, less of a risk. And it does strike me that a lot of the differences between people is around your own encumbrance, your experiences, the role models you have, the ability, the money, all of those things. And I think that's a very valuable message that's there, is that we're not all taking the same risks, if indeed we can take.
Absolutely. And there's a chapter on entrepreneurs, and the entrepreneurs in the chapter come from very, very different risk profiles, socioeconomic profiles. And one of the questions is, if you don't have that infrastructure, how do you get it? How do you create the safety net that you need? And what if we had more of a safety net there in the first place? And if you have the safety net, what's your obligation to pay it forward? Very, very interesting societal questions. And they're not just moral questions, but they're economic questions. There are questions of how do we tap into all of the resource that we have? How do we maximize human capital? And that means particularly going to these communities where there's so much there. There's drive, there's dreams, there's creativity, there's knowledge, there's thirst for more learning. How do we really tap into that and create the risk ecosystem that allows these untapped communities to really flourish and thrive? Because, a society can't thrive unless it's tapping all of its potential. And I don't think there's any society in the world that's doing that right now.
And it's amazing, because if you looked at any other form of resource, you'd be going, we need to get the most out of that. We would be using it really, and probably abusing it in many cases. But actually that untapped potential, I think, is absolutely huge. One of the risks, Michele, of talking to you is that time just flies. And I've just looked at the clock and realized that we are running out of time. You kind of answered this question in part, but I'm going to ask it again just in case there's some additional details, which is, what's next for you? You've written the book. You've talked about wanting to get involved in policy. Is there another book on the way? Are you finding conversations with people that are inspiring the next book? Apart from promoting this amazing piece of work, what's on the horizon for you for the next year or so?
Well, every time I finish a book, I send out a memo to my future self that says, next time you think about doing a book, remind yourself how hard it is and maybe consider not doing it. And that has not worked. This is my fourth book. So I'm putting off all considerations of another book. But what I'm really focused on right now is making sure that this book doesn't stay between the two covers. Very much like the Gray Rhino that took all sorts of unexpected directions. I want this book to be part of a conversation. And I want to do everything that I can to support and amplify and spread that conversation in so many contexts. I've got a bunch of conversations coming up about, risk and the future of work, about risk skills. There's going to be a webinar focused on policy considerations, and really help people to apply the ideas that are in the book so that it has an impact in real life. I mean, the best part about the Gray Rhino was when people would come to me and say, this has changed my life. A banker in China told me that she'd made a loan and she read my book and she started getting really, really worried, and she got the loan paid back early, and then the company went bankrupt. And I went, whoa. So, I hear these real life stories like that, or, someone who was setting up a risk management project profile at the company, and that, people would see her running down the hall and they'd say, oh, I got a Gray Rhino for you. I got a Gray Rhino for you. Or, the impact in China, where they've really been applying it to financial risk. So I really want to see that impact from the new book. And it's sort of a mirror to the Gray Rhino, where I had these unexpected personal applications of, business and policy and strategy and finance concepts. And so this one, as you probably guessed from the way I really put myself into it and took a much more personal approach, but that's got huge business and policy and finance implications as well. And I've always felt about policy that for it to really, really work, you need lots and lots of people to get on board with it. And so I'm hoping that as more and more individuals start thinking about these sort of things, we can change the trajectory of that feedback loop between individuals, societies, policies and organizations, and hopefully set it right. And yes, I will be going back, I think, to a little bit more of the policy detail, but making very sure that it's relevant to everybody, that it's, not just for wonks.
Amazing. Listen, I knew it was going to be a great conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it and been inspired to think, which is always the biggest compliment I can pay people. So thank you, one, for writing some great books that have just really, really, helped me think about things differently. And thank you also for being an amazing guest on the podcast. I will put links to all of your things in the show notes. But for now, thank you so much for appearing on the podcast.
Thank you for a really great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Michele for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Michele's work, the Gray Rhino, You Are What You Risk, and the artwork called Real Rhinos Wear Pink, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major platforms. If you like the show and haven't yet left a 5-star review for it, please do so. It really does help. If you're interested in finding out more about human risk, the work I do with clients, and to watch videos and subscribe to the newsletter, visit human-risk.com. And you can find me on Twitter at HumanRiskLTD. I'll be back very soon with another episode in this series, but in the meantime, stay safe. Remember that you are what you risk, and thanks for listening.